The night my husband betrayed me, he did not raise his voice. There was no argument, no slammed door, nothing I could have heard from the top of the stairs. There was only a man sitting alone at our kitchen table at 1 a.m, the light of a laptop on his face, waiting for an email that would tell him whether the little girl asleep down the hall was really his. Her name is Olivia. She was 6 years old. She had his stubbornness and my laugh, and that night, while she slept with her arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit, her own father was paying a stranger to prove she did not belong to him. I did not know any of it was happening. I was asleep. And by the time I woke up, the marriage I thought I understood was already gone. To understand how a good man ends up doing something like that, you first have to understand his mother. For 6 years, Barbara had been telling her son the same thing, slowly and patiently, the way water wears down stone. She would say it at dinners. She would say it on the phone. She would look at our daughter across a crowded room and say the child had nothing of him in her face, that no son of hers could have made a girl who looked like that a woman like me was simply not the faithful kind. I laughed it off for years. I told Daniel his mother was lonely and bitter and that her words meant nothing at all. I believed that if I just stayed kind, and stayed patient, she would eventually run out of poison. I was wrong about how much of it she had left. What I would only learn much later was that Daniel had stopped laughing it off long before I did. The doubt his mother planted had taken root somewhere I could not see, and one ordinary week, he ordered a plain cardboard box and hid it inside his car. He waited until the house was asleep, then sat on the edge of Olivia's bed in the middle of a bedtime story and ran a cotton swab along the inside of her cheek while she giggled and thought the whole thing was a game. He sealed it into an envelope. He drove it to a mailbox before the sun came up. And then, because some part of him needed to be certain the test itself could even be trusted, he did one more small thing that night, a single quiet decision that would end up destroying far more than just our marriage. 11 days later, the email arrived. Daniel opened it at that same kitchen table, in that same gray hour before dawn, and he read the line that told him Olivia was his daughter beyond any reasonable doubt. 99.9%. For 6 years, his mother had sworn our child belonged to another man, and in a single sentence, the truth burned every word of it to the ground. I had never lied to him. I had never once betrayed him. He should have closed that laptop and climbed the stairs, and held me while I slept. Instead, he kept scrolling, down past the part about Olivia, into a section he had never even thought about, and there he found one short word sitting beside a name he had known his entire life. The word was father. And it was attached to the wrong man. Before we get into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I want you to sit for a moment with the shape of what happened here, because it is the part one still cannot fully forgive. For 6 years, one woman stood inside my home and accused me of betraying my husband. She said it with such steady certainty that she eventually convinced her own son to believe her. And the test she pushed him toward, the test that was supposed to finally expose me as a liar and a cheat, did the exact opposite of what she wanted. It cleared me completely. Then it turned around like a blade and pointed straight back at the woman who had thrown the very first stone. The accusation she had spent 6 years carefully building did not destroy me in the end. It destroyed her. Everything she ever said about me turned out to be a confession. She did not realize she was making out loud. And that left every one of us with questions I am honestly still trying to answer. If I never strayed, and Olivia was truly Daniel's daughter, then who inside this family had actually been carrying a secret all these years? Why would a mother spend 6 years of her own life trying to convince her son that his wife was unfaithful and his child was not his own? What could possibly be worth that much cruelty, repeated that many times, in front of that many people? I used to think Barbara simply hated me. I told myself it was about class, or jealousy, or the ordinary resentment some women carry toward whoever their son chooses to love. But cruelty that patient, that organized, and that relentless is almost never really about the person it appears to be aimed at. I have to be honest about my own wound in all of this, because it would be easy to make Barbara the only villain in the story. The morning I found the receipt, and then the second testing kit, and finally understood that my husband had tested our daughter behind my back, something inside me broke that has never completely healed. It was not the science that hurt me. It was the knowledge that the man who promised to stand beside me had listened to his mother long enough to believe, even for one single moment, that I was capable of that. That he could look at Olivia, our Olivia, and quietly wonder. 6 years of marriage, and a part of him still kept the door open to the idea that I was a liar. The test cleared my name. It did not clear that. Because the name sitting beside that one short word, the word that said father, was not a stranger to any of us. It was not some forgotten man from a single encounter 40 years earlier whose face no one alive would even recognize. It was a name we spoke warmly at every holiday. A name carved into the very same family tree that Barbara loved to brag about, the same proud bloodline she had waved over my head for years like living proof that I would never truly measure up to them. The man who fathered my husband had been sitting at that dinner table for 40 years, just a few feet away from the man who raised him, watching a boy he had helped bring into the world grow up and call another man dad. And the affair, somehow, is not even the most devastating part. So this is not really a story about a DNA test. The test was only the spark that finally lit something that had been sitting in the dark for almost 4 decades. This is a story about a family that quietly built itself on top of a lie, about a woman who protected that lie by setting fire to the reputation of someone who had never done a thing to her, and about 2 brothers who carried a secret between them until both the secret and the men who kept it were gone. It is about my husband, who betrayed my trust in the cruelest way I can imagine, and who then had to watch his entire sense of who he was come apart in a single night. And it is about Olivia, the only truly innocent person in any of it, whose small cheek swab told a truth that 40 years of silence never could. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a version of us that still makes me ache to remember. I met Daniel in the most ordinary way 2 people can meet, at a friend's crowded birthday dinner where neither of us really wanted to be. He was quiet in a room full of loud people, and he laughed at something I said when no one else had even heard it, and that was that. We were married within 2 years. He was steady in a way I had never had in my life before him, the kind of man who remembered the small things, who fixed what was broken without being asked, who called his mother every Sunday without fail. I loved that about him then. That same loyalty, that same need to be a good son, is the thread that would later be pulled until our whole life came apart in my hands. We waited longer than we wanted for a child. There were a few hard years in there that I will not lay out for strangers. Years of hope and quiet disappointment that tested whether we would make it at all. And then we had Olivia. I remember the weight of her on my chest in that hospital room, and the way Daniel sat beside us and just stared at her like he could not believe she was allowed to be ours. He counted her fingers twice. He cried, which he almost never did. For the first few years of her life, we were the family I had always pictured when I was a girl who did not have one of her own. Olivia had his stubborn chin and my loud laugh, and our house was small and warm and full of noise. I thought the hardest part of our story was already behind us. It was not. The one shadow over all of it, from the very first day, was Daniel's mother. Barbara never wanted to like me, and she did not bother to pretend otherwise. At our wedding she told a cousin, just loud enough for me to hear it, that her son could have done better. She had a way of making a compliment land like an insult, of asking about my family in a tone that already knew the answer she wanted. My people were not her people. We did not come from anything she considered worth coming from. And in Barbara's world, where you came from was the only thing that truly counted. I spent years trying to win her over with patience and politeness, bringing the dish she liked, laughing at the jokes that were quietly at my expense. I told myself she would soften eventually. I did not yet understand what I was actually up against. To understand Barbara at all, you have to understand how she felt about the Hale name. She treated it like a title handed down from something noble. There was a framed family tree in her hallway, hand-drawn and carefully labeled, and she would walk guests past it the way other people show off expensive art. She could recite 4 generations without pausing for breath. She was endlessly proud of the family's deep Irish roots, and she brought it up constantly, at dinners, at holidays, any time she wanted to remind the room that the Hales were people of real substance. It sounds almost harmless when I describe it now, a lonely woman clinging to her lineage. But that pride was not really pride. I would come to learn that the people who guard a bloodline the loudest are sometimes the very ones with the most reason to fear what is actually written inside it. Daniel was her only son, and he carried the full weight of that. Barbara had raised him to believe that loyalty to family came before almost everything else, and he had absorbed it so completely that he could not see it as anything other than ordinary love. He could not tell his mother no. Not about small things, and as it turned out, not about the one enormous thing that would break us in half. When she criticized me, he would go quiet instead of defending me, and afterward he would explain that she was old, that she was lonely, that it was easier to let it pass than to start a fight. I used to find it maddening. Now I understand it was something deeper than weakness. He had spent his entire life being the perfect son to a woman who, it would turn out, had built that whole role on top of a lie. The person who balanced all of it, the one who made those family gatherings bearable, was Daniel's father, Thomas. If Barbara was sharp edges and bloodline, Thomas was the opposite of her in every way. He was a quiet, steady, unshowy man who said very little and noticed almost everything. He had worked the same job for 30 years, kept his word, and loved his son in that plain, undemonstrative way men of his generation often did, through actions instead of speeches. Daniel idolized him. Everything good and solid in my husband came from that man, and I could see it every single time the two of them stood together in a room. Thomas was kind to me from the very first day, in a way Barbara never was, almost as if he was quietly apologizing for her. He passed away 2 years before any of this began. I am almost grateful he did not live to see it. Almost. And then there was Raymond. Raymond was Thomas's younger brother, Daniel's uncle, and he was the one everyone actually looked forward to seeing. Where Thomas was quiet, Raymond filled the room. He told the long stories, he slipped the kids money when their parents were not looking, he taught Daniel to drive in an empty parking lot one summer and laughed the entire time. Olivia adored him. He always seemed genuinely delighted by Daniel in a way that, looking back now, I wish I had paid far more attention to. There was a warmth there that ran a little deeper than an uncle's usual fondness, a way he would watch my husband across a room and hold the look just a beat longer than felt ordinary. At the time I thought it was lovely. I thought it meant the family had at least one person in it who loved without conditions. I was right about that part, at least. There is one memory from those years that I dismissed entirely at the time, and that I have replayed 100 times since. It was an ordinary holiday at Barbara's house. I went looking for Daniel and found him standing just outside the kitchen doorway, and inside, Thomas and Raymond were close together, talking low. The second Daniel stepped into the room, both men stopped. It was not the natural pause of a private joke being tucked away. It was a full, careful silence, the kind two people fall into when the thing they were discussing is the exact person who has just walked in. Thomas changed the subject to the weather. Raymond suddenly needed another drink. I noticed it for half a second and then I let it go, because what else do you do with a moment that small? I did not know I had just seen the edge of a secret two brothers had carried for 40 years. There was another sign, and this one involved Barbara directly. One Christmas, a few years before Thomas died, someone in the extended family handed out those popular ancestry kits as a novelty gift, the little tubes you spit into and mail away to learn where your people came from. It was meant to be fun, especially for a family that prized its heritage the way the Hales did. Everyone was laughing about it and comparing what they hoped to find. And Barbara, the woman who could recite 4 generations of Irish ancestry from memory, went completely still. She thanked the person who gave it in a flat little voice, slipped her kit into a drawer in the side table, and changed the subject so firmly that no one dared bring it up again. I remember thinking it was a strange reaction from someone so obsessed with lineage. I had no idea I was watching fear wearing the costume of good manners. The campaign against me, the one that would eventually drive my husband to test our own child, did not begin as an open accusation. It began the day Olivia was born. Barbara came to the hospital, and instead of joy, she held my daughter at arm's length and studied her little face with a strange, searching expression. She said the baby did not look like a Hale. She said it lightly, the way you might remark on the weather, but she said it. Over the following months it slowly became a theme. Olivia had none of Daniel in her. Olivia had my coloring, my family's features, nothing of theirs at all. Each comment on its own was small enough to wave away, and I waved away every single one of them. But Barbara was not making idle observations. She was laying brick after brick, patiently building toward the thing she would one day say out loud. And then one evening, about a year before the test, she finally said it. We were all at dinner, and Daniel had stepped away from the table, and as he came back Barbara leaned toward him and asked, in a voice she made sure was just quiet enough to feel private and just loud enough for me to catch, whether he had ever truly let himself wonder if Olivia was really his. Not whether she looked like him. Whether she was his. The whole table heard the shape of it. I felt the floor tilt under me. I waited for Daniel to laugh. Or to tell his mother she had finally gone too far. He did neither. He just looked at our daughter across the table, and for the first time in 6 years, I watched a real question move across my husband's face. That question is where everything begins. That question did not leave the table when dinner ended. I have gone back to that night so many times, because I believe it was the exact moment our marriage began to die without either of us knowing it yet. On the drive home, Daniel was silent. I asked him if his mother had upset him, and he said no, she was just being herself, and he turned up the radio. But something had landed in him that evening that did not land in me. I went to bed assuming we had simply survived another awkward dinner with Barbara, the way we always did. Daniel lay awake beside me with his mother's voice running on a loop inside his head, asking the one question a man is never supposed to ask about his own child, and slowly finding that he could no longer make it go quiet. In the weeks that followed, my husband quietly became a stranger inside our own house. It was nothing I could point to directly, which is the cruelest kind of change there is. He was a little further away at dinner. He held Olivia a beat differently when he picked her up, and he studied her face when he thought I was not watching. He was short with me over small things and then overly gentle an hour later, as though apologizing for a thought he had not said out loud. I told myself it was stress at work. I asked him twice if everything was all right, and he said that it was, and I chose to believe him, because the alternative simply did not occur to me. It never once entered my mind that the man I had built my whole life with was lying awake deciding whether to put our daughter's DNA in an envelope. What I did not see, because it happened on phone calls I was never part of, was that Barbara had sensed the crack she had spent 6 years working toward, and she pressed her thumb directly into it. She called him far more often in those weeks. She stopped bothering with the gentle version. According to what Daniel finally told me much later, she said it plainly now, that a real man would simply want to know the truth, that there was no shame at all in a simple test, that she only wanted to protect him and his good name from a woman she had never once trusted. She dressed up the most invasive thing he could possibly do to his own family as an act of strength and plain common sense. And a son who had never in his life been able to refuse his mother slowly, quietly, began to agree with her. I want to be fair to Daniel here, even now, because the version of this story where he is simply a monster is not the honest one. He was ashamed of the thought long before he ever acted on it. He told me afterward that he hated himself through those weeks, that he would look at Olivia asleep in her bed and feel sick that the question was even in his head. He loved her. There was never a single moment that he did not love her. But his mother had spent 6 years patiently teaching him to distrust me, and shame is a strange and slippery thing. Sometimes it does not stop a person from doing the wrong thing at all. Sometimes it only drives them to do it in secret, alone, in the dark, where no one who loves them can reach in and talk them out of it. That is exactly the road my husband took. So one ordinary weekday, while I was out with Olivia at her swimming lesson, Daniel sat down at his computer and ordered a home DNA testing kit. He chose a plain one, nothing that would announce itself on a doorstep, and he arranged for it to arrive on a day he knew he would be home before me. When the small box came, he did not even open it inside the house. He carried it out to his car and slid it under the seat, the way you hide a thing you already know is wrong. It sat in that car for 2 full days while he worked up the nerve. He drove me and Olivia around in that car. We sang along to her favorite songs in that car, with the thing that would end our family tucked beneath the driver's seat the entire time. He said nothing at all. He simply waited for the right night. The right night, as he decided it, was a Tuesday. I had a headache and went to bed early, which I have never quite forgiven myself for, as if I could have stopped any of it had I only stayed awake. Daniel offered to put Olivia to bed, and I was grateful, and I kissed them both goodnight and went upstairs. He read her the book about the rabbit, the one she made us read every single night without fail. And somewhere in the middle of it, he slipped the swab out of his pocket and told our 6-year-old daughter that it was a special kind of toothbrush the doctor wanted to try out. She thought it was hilarious. She opened her mouth and giggled while her own father gently ran the swab along the inside of her cheek, collecting the proof he had convinced himself he needed that she might not really be his. And then he did the one thing that, in the end, would matter more than all the rest of it. The kit he had bought allowed for more than one sample, and Daniel had a thought that felt, to him, like nothing more than simple caution. Before he trusted whatever this test was about to tell him about Olivia, he wanted to be certain the test was even accurate to begin with. So he swabbed his own cheek as well, planning to check his own result against everything he already knew to be true about himself, his family, his blood. It was meant to be the control. The safe, sensible part of the plan. The part that would quietly confirm the science before he let any of it near his heart. He had no idea he had just collected the single most dangerous piece of evidence in this entire story. He sealed both samples into the envelope at the kitchen table once the house had gone completely quiet. He filled out the form in his careful handwriting. He labeled them, the child and himself, and he closed it all up. The next morning, before any of us were awake, he drove to a mailbox a few streets away, not the one near our house, and he sent it off. I made him coffee that morning. I remember it clearly, because it was such a deeply ordinary morning. He kissed me at the door and told me he loved me and left for work, and I had absolutely no idea that he had just mailed away a question that was going to detonate everything I believed was solid. The envelope was already gone. There was nothing left to do now except wait, and Daniel turned out to be very good at hiding that he was waiting at all. The wait was 11 days, and they were 11 of the strangest days of our entire marriage, though only one of us understood why. Daniel checked his phone constantly. He grew quieter, and then forced himself to seem cheerful, which was somehow even worse to be around. He started bringing in the mail himself, beating me to the box every single afternoon, intercepting anything that might give him away. I noticed a few of these little things in passing, and I stitched each one neatly into the story I had already chosen to believe, that work was hard, that he was tired, that this was simply a rough patch every marriage eventually goes through. We even had a good weekend right in the middle of it, an ordinary family weekend with pancakes and a trip to the park, and Daniel held himself together the whole time with a result he was dreading, sitting in a lab somewhere, getting closer. There was one night during that stretch when I very nearly found out. I went looking for the car charger and opened the console between the seats, and there was a folded receipt in there that I did not recognize, printed with the name of a company I had never heard of. I held it in my hand for a second. I almost asked him about it. And then Olivia called for me from the other room, and I set the receipt down, and the question floated out of my head as quickly as it had arrived. I have thought about that little receipt, eh? 1,000 times since. If I had only asked him that night, perhaps he would have told me, perhaps we could have faced whatever was coming together instead of having it dropped on us separately. But I did not ask. I put the receipt back, closed the console, and walked away from the truth one more time. The results came on a Thursday. I know that now, although I did not know it then, because I was upstairs asleep when they landed. Daniel had set the account to email him the moment anything posted, and the message arrived a little after midnight, while the whole house was dark and still. He had been half expecting it for days, and yet, he told me later, his hands were not steady when he saw that subject line glowing on his screen. He climbed out of bed without waking me. He went down to the kitchen, to that very same table where his mother's voice had first taken hold of him, and he sat down in front of his laptop in the dark with his heart pounding hard in his chest. Everything he believed he was about to learn was about Olivia. He was wrong about that part, too. He opened the email. Inside it was a link, and the link led to a page laying out his results and Olivia's, side by side, the way that company lays out the end of a person's entire understanding of their own life. 2 answers were waiting there for him on that screen. One of them was the answer he had been so afraid of for 6 years, the question his mother had planted about our daughter, and he went searching for that one first. The other answer was one he had never once thought to fear, because it had never crossed his mind that the question even existed. He did not see it yet. He was still staring at the line about Olivia. In just a moment he would scroll down. And when he finally did, the entire floor of his life was going to give way beneath him. He scrolled down. And there it was, the answer to the only question he thought he had come for. Olivia was his daughter. 99.9%, the same. Cold certainty these tests always carry. There was no ambiguity, no maybe, no room left anywhere for his mother's 6 years of doubt. The little girl asleep upstairs with her arm wrapped around a stuffed rabbit was his, completely and beyond argument. Daniel told me later that his first feeling was relief so total it made him dizzy, a wave of it that left him shaking at that dark kitchen table. And right behind the relief, before he could even begin to enjoy it, came the shame, rolling in like cold water, because he understood in that same instant exactly what he had just done, and exactly what it said about the kind of man he had quietly allowed himself to become. He had tested his own child. He had taken a swab from our daughter's mouth in the middle of a bedtime story and mailed it off to strangers because his mother told him to doubt the woman he married. And the result was that I had been telling the truth for 6 years. Every accusation Barbara ever made, every comment about Olivia's face, every quiet suggestion that I was not the faithful kind, all of it was a lie, and now he had paid a laboratory to prove it. He sat there in the dark holding the proof of my innocence and the proof of his own betrayal in the very same moment. He told me he almost came upstairs right then to wake me and confess all of it. I have often wished that he had. If he had stopped there, this would be a smaller and far more survivable story. But he did not stop there. He kept reading. Because the page did not end with Olivia. Remember that Daniel had swabbed his own cheek too, the control, the part meant only to prove the test could be trusted before he believed what it said about our daughter. So his own profile was sitting right there on the screen, just beneath hers. He clicked into it almost out of habit, wanting to watch the test get the easy things right about him, the things he already knew about himself, before he let himself fully trust the hard thing it had just told him about. Olivia. He expected a formality. He expected to glance at it, nod to himself, and finally close the laptop and come up to bed. Instead, his own results were about to hand him something the test had never even been asked to look for, something no one in that family had ever meant for another living soul to find. Here is the thing about these companies that almost no one stops to think about while they are spitting into the little tube. They do not only tell you where your ancestors came from. They quietly take your DNA and compare it against every other person who has ever tested with them, and they build you a list of your living relatives, ranked precisely by how much blood you share with each one. And Daniel, without ever once thinking about it, had chosen the very same well-known service that those novelty Christmas kits had come from years earlier. He had not given that a single thought. But it mattered more than anything, because not every one of those Christmas kits had ended up forgotten in a drawer the way Barbara's had. At least one person in that family had cheerfully filled theirs out and mailed it away, certain it was nothing but a bit of holiday fun, and it had been sitting quietly in that database ever since. So when Daniel opened the section that listed his relatives, he was not staring at a wall of strangers after all. He was looking at a pool that already held someone who shared his blood, a person who had tested years before and then forgotten the whole thing entirely. Most of the list was the ordinary scatter of distant cousins that anyone finds in there. But at the very top, sitting high above everyone else, was a single match the system had flagged in the very highest category it has. The amount of shared DNA was not in the range of a cousin, or even of a sibling. It was in the range of a parent. Half of Daniel's entire genetic code traced directly back to one living person who was already inside that database, someone the system was now calmly informing. Him was either his mother or his father. Think about what that actually meant, because Daniel had to sit alone in the dark and think about it too. A parent-level match means a mother or a father, and his mother had never once been a mystery to anyone. Barbara was not in any database. She would sooner have set herself on fire than spit into one of those tubes, as I would later come to understand all too well. So this match, this person who shared half of his blood, had to sit on the other side of him. It had to connect somehow to his father. And his father was Thomas, the quiet, steady man he had idolized his whole life, the man who had been dead for 2 years and had certainly never registered his DNA anywhere on this earth. For a little while, Daniel let himself believe there was still an innocent answer waiting at the end of all this, and he searched for it the way a man searches for the exit in a burning room. His first theory was the kindest one, that the database had simply made a mistake. He read everything he could find about how often these matches turn out to be wrong at the parent level. The answer, which he did not want, was that they are almost never wrong at that level. The further out you go, distant cousins and beyond, the blurrier the science becomes. But a parent is the one relationship these tests get right nearly every single time, because half of your DNA is not some subtle signal, it is the loudest thing in the entire report. He read it again and again, hoping to find the exception, the loophole, the comforting footnote at the bottom. There was none. The thing he was looking at was, by every measure available to him, as close to certain as that kind of science ever gets. So he let go of the error theory, and he reached for the next one. His second theory was almost a comfort, in a strange way. Maybe, he thought, his father Thomas had not been the saint that everyone believed. Maybe Thomas had a child somewhere before he ever married Barbara, a secret half-sibling out in the world, and this match was simply them. That would explain a surprise name in the database while leaving Daniel still a Hale, still Thomas's son, still exactly who he had always been. He held on to that idea for almost a full day. But the math would not let him keep it. A half-sibling shares a quarter of your DNA. This match shared half. This was not someone who merely happened to have the same father as Daniel. This was someone who was Daniel's father, or close enough to it that the distinction no longer offered any shelter at all. And Thomas was gone, and had never tested. So it was not Thomas. And that was the door Daniel had been refusing to walk through, the one his mind kept circling and backing away from for 2 long weeks. If the match sat at the parent level, and it was not his mother, and it was not his father Thomas, then there was only one explanation left standing in the room. The man who raised him, the man whose name he carried, the man he had grieved for 2 years and modeled his entire self upon, was not his father by blood. Somewhere in the story of his own beginning was a man he had never once been told about. Which meant, his mother, the woman who had spent 6 years branding me an adulteress in front of the whole family, was hiding an adultery of her very own, one old enough to have produced her only son. Daniel sat with that for a long time before he could even let himself believe it was real. While my husband was quietly coming apart over those results, I was living in the same house, watching a man I loved disappear by inches and inventing gentler explanations for all of it. This was the worst stretch of those weeks for me, because something was clearly wrong now in a way I could no longer file under stress at work. He was not sleeping. He flinched whenever his phone lit up. He would sit at dinner and stare at Olivia with an expression I could not read, something that looked almost like grief, and then catch himself and smile. Far too brightly. I asked him, more than once, what was happening to him. I begged him, near the end of it, to just tell me what was wrong. He kept saying it was nothing, that he was fine, that I was imagining things. And I knew, the way a wife always knows, that he was lying directly to my face. I found out the way people always seem to find out, by accident, in the middle of an ordinary moment. He had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went out to move the car, and I went to close it, so Olivia would not smear it with her hands, and the screen was still lit. I was not snooping. I want that on the record, for whatever it is worth now. I simply saw it. A page with our daughter's name on it, and percentages, and the logo of a company I had seen one time before, on a folded receipt in his console months earlier. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was actually looking at. And then it landed all at once, the entire shape of what he had done, and I had to put my hand flat on the counter just to keep myself standing upright. When he came back inside, I was holding the laptop, and I did not have to say a single word. The look on his face told me that all of it was true. I asked him, very quietly, if he had tested our daughter. He said yes. I asked him if he had done it because of his mother. He said yes. And something in me that had been holding this whole family together for 6 years simply let go. It was not even the test that broke me, in the end. It was the knowing. The knowing that the man who promised to stand beside me had looked at Olivia, our Olivia, and let his mother put enough doubt in him to mail her DNA off to strangers. He had believed, somewhere inside himself, that I was capable of that. The test cleared my name. It could never clear what it meant that he had needed one at all. We had the worst fight of our marriage that night, in low voices so that Olivia would not hear us, which is its own special kind of awful. I said things I had been swallowing for 6 years. He did not defend himself, which somehow made it worse, because a part of me wanted him to fight back so I would have something solid to push against. But underneath all of his apologies, there was something else, something he was still not telling me even then, a fear that had nothing to do with our argument at all. At one point he said, almost to himself, that there was something else he had to be sure of first, something he could not yet explain to me. I was far too hurt that night to hear it as anything but an excuse. I did not understand that my husband was standing at the edge of a second cliff, one I knew nothing about, and was about to go over it. Because while our marriage was cracking open in that kitchen, Daniel had already done the one thing he could never take back. In the days before I found the laptop, he had gone back to that relative match over and over, unable to leave it alone. He had stared at the percentage that said, parent. He had finally accepted that Thomas was not his father by blood, and that his mother had carried a secret for more than 40 years. And then he made himself do the last thing there was left to do. He clicked on the match itself, the person sitting at the very top of his list, the living human being who shared half of his DNA, to see the name attached to the account. He had braced himself for a stranger. He had told himself it would be some unknown man, a name that meant nothing to him, a face he would never once have to see. It was not a stranger. The name on that account was one Daniel had known his entire life. It was a name he had spoken at every holiday, a name Olivia called out with delight whenever its owner walked through our door, a name stitched into the very same family that Barbara bragged about without ever once suspecting what it truly meant. Beside that familiar name, the system had placed its calm, clinical label for the closest male relationship it knows how to name. Daniel. Sat alone at that table and stared at it until the letters stopped looking like a name at all. I am not going to tell you whose it was, not yet, because I need you to arrive at it the way he had to, slowly, with the ground already gone from under him. But I will tell you this much tonight. The man who fathered my husband had been sitting at our table for 40 years. And he was still alive. For 2 full days after he found that name, Daniel did not act on it. He needed to be certain, truly certain, before he set fire to whatever was left of his family with it. So he did something careful and quiet. He found a genetic counselor, a real one, and he paid for an hour of her time and laid the entire thing out in front of her, the 2 tests, the ancestry, the match sitting at the top of his list. He half hoped she would find the flaw he had missed, the reason it was all a simple mistake. She did not. She walked him through it gently and plainly, and her conclusion was the very same one he had been running from for weeks. A match that strong meant a parent. The man who raised him was not his father. There was no version of the science in which that was untrue. I think people underestimate what a thing like that does to a person. Daniel had not simply learned a fact. He had lost his father a second time. Thomas had already died 2 years before, and Daniel had grieved him the ordinary way, the way you grieve a good and quiet man. Now he had to grieve him all over again, except this time he was grieving the very idea of him, the belief that he was Thomas's son, that the man he had spent his whole life trying to be worthy of had given him anything at all beyond a name and a home. Every time someone had said he had his father's hands, or his father's patience, came apart in his memory. He told me he sat in his car outside that office and cried the way he had not cried since the funeral. For a man who almost never cried, that is what this cost him. And that, finally, was when he told me. He came home from that appointment hollowed out, and the anger I had been carrying since the moment I found the laptop met something in his face that stopped me cold. He sat me down and he told me everything. Not only the test on Olivia, which I already knew about, but the other thing, the swab he had taken of his own cheek, the ancestry that was not his, the match at the very top of the list. He told me that the man who raised him was not his father, and that somewhere out there was a man who was. I sat across from my husband, still furious with him, still wounded in a way that had not begun to heal, and I watched him fall apart in front of me, and I did the only thing a person can do in that moment. I took his hand. We were not healed that night. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story would have us fall into each other's arms and forgive everything in one tearful moment, and that is simply not what happened. I was still angry. He was still the man who had tested our daughter behind my back. But sitting there, watching the foundation of his entire identity give way beneath him, I understood that whatever Barbara had set in motion 6 years ago was so much larger and so much older than our marriage. She had not just been trying to break the 2 of us. She had been protecting something. And both of us, sitting at that table, arrived at the very same realization in the very same breath. There was only one person left alive who could explain what had truly happened all those years ago. And we both knew exactly where she lived. We went to Barbara's house the next morning. Daniel barely spoke a word on the drive over. I remember the ordinary street sliding past the window, people walking their dogs, children waiting for the bus, the whole world carrying on as though this were any other day, while the 2 of us drove toward the end of everything Barbara had ever built. I had spent 6 years being polite to that woman. I had brought the dish she liked. I had laughed at the jokes that were quietly about me. And now I was going to sit in her living room while her son asked her the one question her entire life had been arranged to make certain no one would ever ask. I did not feel triumphant. I want you to understand that clearly. I mostly felt sick, and somewhere underneath the sickness, very far down, I felt a kind of terrible pity I had not expected to feel. She knew something was wrong the instant she opened the door and saw both of our faces. Barbara was many things, but she was never slow. She tried, at first, to do exactly what she had always done. She offered us coffee. She made a sharp little remark about us arriving without calling ahead. And when Daniel did not soften, when he sat down across from her and said that they needed to talk, she did the thing she had done for 6 years without ever failing. She turned to me. She asked what I had been telling her son now. She reached, on pure instinct, for the same weapon she always reached for, the suggestion that I was the problem, that I was the liar in the room, that whatever was wrong here had surely started with me. It was the very last time she would ever be able to use that weapon. And she did not yet know it. Daniel cut her off. He told her, very quietly, that he had taken a DNA test. He was watching her face when he said it, and he told me later that he saw something flicker there, something fast, before she managed to cover it. She asked, still sharp, what the test had said about Olivia, already reaching for the victory she had been chasing for 6 years. And Daniel told her. He said the test proved Olivia was his, completely, that I had never once betrayed him, that everything she had spent 6 years saying about me had been false. He let that sit in the room for a long moment. Barbara did not apologize. She barely even reacted to it. And that, Daniel said, was the first instant he truly understood that the accusation about me had never really been the point. It had only ever been the distraction. Then he told her the rest of it. He said that he had tested himself as well, and that the test had found his father. He said that the man it found was not Thomas. He watched every bit of color drain out of his mother's face. For a few seconds she reached for the only move she had left, the denial, the insistence that the tests were nonsense, that these companies were frauds, that he could not possibly choose to believe a website over his own mother. But her voice did not carry its usual iron. It came out thin and frightened, and both of us heard it plainly. Barbara had spent 40 years certain that this conversation would never come, because the only proof had been locked inside her own body and the bodies of 2 men, one of them already dead. She had not counted on a little plastic tube. She had not counted on her own grandchild's cheek. And then, all at once, the fight simply went out of her. I have never seen a person change so completely in the space of a single breath. The woman who had ruled that family by the sheer force of her certainty for as long as I had known her, seemed to fold inward, to become old and small right there in her chair. She stopped denying. In a voice I had never once heard her use, she admitted it. She had been unfaithful to Thomas, long ago, before Daniel was ever born. She had carried on with another man. And Daniel, the son she had built her entire proud identity around, the heir to the precious Hale name she guarded so fiercely, had been the result of that affair. The bloodline she had waved over my head for 6 years did not even run in the one person she claimed it for the most. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, the way I had to in that living room. For 6 years, this woman had stood inside my home and called me a cheat. She had convinced her own son to doubt me, had driven him to test our daughter in secret, had nearly ended our marriage, all over an infidelity that had only ever existed in her imagination. And the entire time, she was the one who had actually done it. Every accusation she ever threw at me turned out to be a confession about herself. She had not been protecting her family from a faithless woman at all. She had been making absolutely certain that everyone in that family stayed so busy watching me that they would never once turn around and look at her. I had not been her son's wife in her eyes. I had been her shield. And she had used me for 6 years without a flicker of guilt. When Daniel asked her why me, why 6 years of it, she said something I will never forget as long as I live. She said that as long as there was a question hanging over my faithfulness, there would never be a question hanging over hers. She had watched those ancestry kits arrive that one Christmas and understood, before anyone else in the room had, that her secret now lived inside everyone's saliva, that any idle, curious test could expose her in a single afternoon. So she got out ahead of it the only way she knew how. She made me the suspect. She made my own daughter the question mark. She poisoned the ground all around her own secret so thoroughly that no one would ever think to dig there. It was, once I finally understood it fully, one of the most calculated things I have ever heard in my life. And there was still one question left in that room she had not answered. Daniel asked her the only thing that mattered now. He asked her who was his father. And for the first time in the entire conversation, Barbara went completely, utterly silent. This was the name she had guarded for 40 years, the one piece she had protected above all the rest, the secret sitting underneath the secret. She would not say it. She looked at the floor, and she shook her head, and she would not say it. But she did not have to say it, because Daniel already knew. He had seen it on the screen with his own eyes. He leaned toward his mother, and he said the name out loud himself, just the one word, the name from the very top of that list. And I watched Barbara close her eyes. I am going to tell you that name now. Because once you hear it, you will understand why this story does not end with the affair at all. His name was Raymond. Daniel's father was Raymond. The fun uncle who filled every room he walked into, who slipped the kids money when no one was looking, who taught my husband to drive in an empty parking lot one summer and laughed the entire time. Raymond was Thomas's younger brother. Do you understand what I am telling you? The man Barbara betrayed her husband with was her husband's own brother. The affair that produced Daniel had happened inside that family, between a woman and the brother of the man she was married to. And for 40 years, the two brothers and Barbara had sat at the same holiday tables, passed the same dishes, and watched the same boy grow up, while one brother raised the son that the other brother had fathered. The bloodline Barbara was so proud of had been right the whole time. She had simply lied about which hail it came from. It is almost too much to hold in your head all at once, and it took me weeks to truly absorb it. Every family photograph I had ever seen on Barbara's wall now meant something completely different. There was Thomas, standing beside his brother, his arm around the boy that everyone called his son. There was Raymond, a few feet away, looking at that very same boy. Two men who knew. Two men who had to stand in the same rooms, year after year, holding the heaviest secret a family can possibly hold, and saying nothing, for the sake of a child who deserved a normal life. I used to think the saddest part of this whole story was the betrayal. The longer I sat with it, the more I understood that the betrayal was almost the simplest part of it. The hardest part was everything those two brothers chose to carry in silence afterward. And suddenly every strange little moment I had filed away over the years had an explanation waiting inside it. The way Raymond always watched Daniel a beat longer than felt ordinary, the warmth in it that ran deeper than any uncle's. The day in that kitchen when I found Thomas and Raymond talking low and they both went silent the very instant Daniel walked in. I had thought it was nothing at all. It was everything. Those two men were not sharing some private joke that afternoon. They were doing what they had quietly done for decades, guarding the one truth that could undo the boy they both, in their own ways, loved. I had been standing at the edge of this secret for years without ever once knowing it was there. The clues had been right in front of me the whole time, hidden inside ordinary family gatherings, waiting for a cheek swab to finally read them aloud. Daniel needed to hear it from Raymond himself. A few days after the confrontation with his mother, he drove out to see the uncle who was, it turned out, his father. I did not go with him for that one. Some conversations a person has to have alone. Raymond was an old man by then, in his 70s, living quietly on his own, and Daniel told me afterward that the moment he stepped through the door, before a single word was even spoken, Raymond already knew why he had come. He said Raymond's face simply crumpled, the way a face does when a thing you have braced yourself against for 40 years finally arrives at your door. There was no denial. There was no performance of surprise. There was just an old man sitting down heavily in his chair and saying, after a silence that felt like it lasted an hour, that he had wondered every day of Daniel's life whether this moment would come. What Raymond told him was not the story of some grand sweeping love affair. It was sadder and far more human than that. He and Barbara had made a single, terrible mistake during a hard year in Thomas and Barbara's marriage, a thing that happened once and was never repeated and was regretted by both of them almost immediately. And then Barbara discovered she was expecting. Raymond said he had offered, more than once over the years, to tell the truth, to take responsibility, to be whatever Daniel might need him to be. Barbara refused him every single time. She had decided that Daniel would be Thomas's son and a Hale heir and nothing else at all, and she had the iron will to enforce that decision for 4 entire decades. So Raymond did the only thing she ever left him room to do. He became the uncle. He loved his son from the one seat at the table he was allowed. And then Daniel asked Raymond the question that had been sitting on his chest since the night he first understood, the question I think he was the most afraid in the world to ask. Did Thomas know? Did the man who raised him, the man he had idolized and grieved and tried his whole life to deserve, know that the boy was not his? Raymond was quiet for a very long time. And then he told Daniel the truth that changes this entire story. Yes. Thomas knew. Thomas had known almost from the very beginning. He had worked it out the way decent, observant men work these things out, quietly, on his own, and he had gone to his brother years before he died and told him plainly that he knew. And then he had made a choice that I still cannot think about without my throat closing on me. Thomas chose Daniel. He told Raymond that as far as he was concerned the matter was closed, that the boy was his son, that he had raised him and loved him and that nothing written in any blood was going to change a single thing about that. He never confronted Barbara about it, not once, not in all the years that followed. He never let it cool the way he held Daniel, or cheered at his games, or sat beside him in the quiet of an evening. He simply decided that the love was real and the blood did not matter, and then he lived that decision every ordinary day until the day he died. The kitchen silence I had witnessed all those years ago was not two men hiding a wound from each other. It was two brothers who had already made their peace, quietly protecting a boy they had agreed, without ever once saying it aloud, to keep safe. I have thought a great deal about the two parents at the center of this story, and the very different choices each of them made with the exact same secret. Barbara took the truth and used it as a reason to lie for 40 years, to control her son, to torment an innocent woman, to nearly destroy a marriage and a child's whole family, all in order to protect herself. Thomas took that identical truth and used it as a reason to love a boy more carefully, more deliberately, more completely, and to ask for nothing at all in return, not even the credit. One of them guarded the secret to save herself. The other carried it to save his son. And the cruel, beautiful irony of all of it is that the man who shared none of Daniel's blood turned out to be the only person in that entire family who never once lied to him about love. As for Barbara, the matriarch who had ruled that family on the strength of a bloodline she herself had betrayed, there was nothing left for her to rule. The test she had spent 6 years pushing her son toward, the test meant to finally expose me, had instead exposed her completely. The family she had spent a lifetime carefully arranging around her own lie came apart around her. Daniel could not look at her for a very long time. Most of the relatives who learned the truth quietly drifted away from her. The proud recitations of the Hale name stopped altogether, because everyone now understood exactly what that name had been hiding. She had built a fortress out of other people's silence, and a few drops of saliva had brought the entire thing down. I do not feel triumph about that, even now. But I will not pretend that I feel nothing, either. Daniel and I did not put our marriage back together overnight. I want to be honest about that all the way to the end, because I think the honest version is the one that might actually help someone watching this. He had betrayed my trust in a way that took a long time to forgive, and forgiving it turned out to be a choice I had to make again and again, not just one time. But he did the work. He cut his mother's voice out of our lives entirely. He went to counseling, first on his own and then together with me. He looked our daughter in the eye every single day and made sure she never carried a single ounce of what the adults around her had done. Slowly, in the unglamorous way that real repair actually happens, we found our way back to something solid. Not the same as before. Something quieter, and in some ways, stronger. Raymond is part of our lives now, out in the open this time. Olivia knows him as her great uncle, and she adores him exactly as she always has, and there is a strange peace in watching an old man finally get to love his granddaughter without hiding any part of the reason why. Daniel visits him often. The two of them are slowly building, in the years Raymond has left, some version of the relationship they were never once allowed to have. And Daniel talks about Thomas more now than ever before, not less. The discovery did not take his father away from him. If anything, it gave Thomas back to him as something even larger than before, a man who chose him on purpose, every single day, for no reason other than love. Olivia will grow up hearing about both of them. She will know she came from a family that, in the end, chose to tell the truth. So that is the story of the secret DNA test that my husband took behind my back, and the result that ended his mother. It did not end her with a courtroom or a punishment. It ended her with the truth, which for a woman like Barbara was the one thing in this world she could never survive. A test she had designed to prove that I was a liar proved instead that the only liar in the room had been her all along. And the deepest thing I have taken from all of it is this. Blood will always tell the truth in the end, because blood cannot keep a secret forever. But love had been telling the truth the entire time as well, quietly, through a man who never said a single word about it. Blood told us who Daniel came from. Love told us, every single day, who his father really was. I have told you everything now, the whole of it, and I find that I am still turning it over in my own hands the same way you probably are right now. So, before you go, I want to hear from you, because I have spent a long time wondering how other people would have handled the thing we lived through. The question I cannot stop asking myself is about Daniel. He betrayed my trust in the worst way I can imagine. He tested our own daughter in secret because his mother told him to doubt me. And yet that same test that revealed his betrayal also tore his entire world apart and handed him a truth that no person should ever have to carry alone. So, I will ask you plainly. If you had been in my place, could you have forgiven him? Tell me honestly in the comments, because some days I am still not certain I know my own answer. And there are two other questions I would love to leave you sitting with tonight. The first is about Thomas, the man who raised Daniel and knew the truth for years and chose to love him anyway, without ever saying a single word about it. If you had been in his place, would you have done the same? Would you have kept that secret to protect your child, or would you have needed the truth out in the open? The second is about Barbara. The longer I sit with what she did, the more I believe her cruelty toward me was never really about me at all. I think it was guilt, wearing the face of an accusation. I think people who attack the loudest are very often hiding the exact thing they are pointing at in everyone else. Tell me if you have ever seen that in your own life. Something tells me a lot of you have. If this story moved you, or if it made you think of someone in your own life, here is what I will ask of you. Take a second to like this video, because it genuinely does help these stories reach the people who most need to hear them. Leave your answer to those questions down in the comments, because I read them, and because the conversation underneath these stories is so often just as powerful as the stories themselves. Subscribe to the channel if you are not already a part of this little corner of it. And if there is someone in your life who would feel this one the same way that you just did, share it with them. These are real and human stories about the families we are handed and the families we choose, and the more they get shared, the more honest those hard conversations are able to become. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Stories like this one are not easy to sit with, and the simple fact that you did, all the way through to the end, says something gentle and good about the kind of person you are. Hold the people who chose you a little bit closer tonight. And the next time you feel tempted to believe the loudest voice in the room, remember that the truth has a quiet way of surfacing on its own, in its own time, no matter how long or how hard someone works to keep it buried. Take care of yourself. And take good care of the family you have built, the one that belongs to you, not because of blood, but because of love.